Shocking abduction and murder of Mayor Gisela Boniel. The tragic consequence of marrying the wrong man. The night was thick with tension. The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the empty road. Gisela Boniel had always felt safe in her small town. But tonight, something was different. Her footsteps echoed in the quiet air as she hurried down the path to her home. The usual hum of the town seemed absent, like the entire world had gone still. A chill crept up her spine. She paused, her breath shallow. A figure stood at the end of the street. Tall. Unmoving. Watching. She recognized him instantly. Alejandro. Her husband. But something wasn't right. His eyes were cold. Empty. Her heart raced. Gisela. His voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. She stepped back, confused. He had never looked at her like this before. The man she had married, the man she trusted, now felt like a stranger. Her hand trembled as she reached for her phone. But before she could unlock it, a low growl came from the shadows. It wasn't a dog. Her stomach twisted. More figures stepped out from behind the trees, closing in on her. No escape. Her eyes flicked from one face to the next. Each one held the same vacant, malicious look. She backed away, her breath quickening. "What's happening? Alejandro, what's going on?" she cried, but her voice trembled. He didn't answer. He just stood there, watching her. And then, as though on cue, one of the men lunged. Gisela screamed, stumbling backward. But there was nowhere to go. The ground beneath her feet seemed to vanish. Suddenly, everything went black. When she awoke, the world was different. Cold. Silent. Her body ached. Her wrists were bound tightly. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The darkness around her was thick. Where was she? What had happened? The last thing she remembered was the face of her husband. And then nothing. Her heart raced again. The air felt suffocating. Gisela tried to move, but her limbs were weak. A figure approached, stepping into the faint light. It was Alejandro. But his eyes, they were no longer cold. They were dead. Without a word, he raised his hand. A sharp metallic glint flashed in the dim light. Gisela's blood ran cold. This was it. She could feel the weight of the blade before she saw it. Her world tilted. A scream of terror was locked inside her throat. Too late. Too late. It ended with a single slash. And then nothing. Darkness swallowed her whole. Gisela couldn't feel anything anymore. The pain was distant, like it belonged to someone else. Her eyes fluttered, struggling to stay open. The silence pressed against her chest, thick and suffocating. She blinked, slowly, forcing her vision into focus. A figure loomed above her, his breath shallow. It was Alejandro. But he wasn't the man she had married. Not anymore. His eyes, empty and hollow, stared down at her with cold detachment. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her body felt like lead. Her fingers twitched, but there was no strength left. Alejandro reached down, brushing her hair from her face. His touch was ice. "We had to do this," he muttered, as though justifying the impossible. "We had no choice, Gisela." She couldn't comprehend what he meant. Her mind was foggy. His words were nonsensical. What was happening? Why was he doing this? Her heart pounded, weak and frantic, as her thoughts scrambled. The world around her was spinning, slipping away. She tried to focus on his face, but it was blurred. Alejandro's eyes flickered. Something flashed across his expression, something almost like regret. But it was gone before she could grasp it. He stepped back. For a moment, everything stood still. Her pulse echoed in her ears. Then, the door creaked open. Two men entered, their faces hidden in shadows. They spoke in low, urgent tones. One of them was tall, broad-shouldered, his voice deep and gruff. "Is it done?" he asked, glancing at Alejandro. "Yes," came the cold reply. The second man didn't speak. He just looked at Gisela, at her pale, still form. "Make sure she's gone," the tall one ordered. Alejandro nodded. His hand reached for the blade, once more. This time, There was no hesitation, no doubt. The final blow came swiftly. And then silence. The men left, their footsteps fading into the night. Gisela's world was no more. But there were whispers, even in death. A faint breath of wind. A shadow in the corner. Someone was still watching. Time passed, but the world didn't forget her. Gisela Boniel's name was spoken in hushed tones, carried on the lips of those who feared the truth. Her disappearance became a shadow over the town. But in the dark corners, the rumors spread like wildfire. She hadn't just been murdered. She'd been betrayed. And that betrayal didn't stop with Alejandro. Something much darker was at play. The authorities had tried to keep the investigation quiet. They wanted the town to believe it was a simple case of domestic violence gone wrong. But the whispers told another story. People started noticing strange things. Faces in the crowd that shouldn't have been there. Unmarked vehicles in the streets at odd hours. And then, one evening, a man was seen walking into the very same house where Gisela had lived. The man was tall, with a hardened expression, and a black leather jacket. He didn't look like a local. He looked like someone from another world. A world of secrets. Of power. A world that had no place in the quiet town of Isla Bonita. His presence unsettled the few who saw him. But it wasn't until he walked into Alejandro's house that people began to really talk. There was no mistaking it. This man wasn't just a stranger. He was part of something bigger. And Alejandro knew him. The door slammed behind them. Inside, the conversation was brief. "Is it done?" the stranger asked, voice tight with urgency. "Almost," Alejandro replied, his voice hollow. "What's the hold-up?" The stranger's tone was sharp, demanding. Alejandro hesitated, but only for a moment. "The mayor's dead. No one will look too closely." "But the others," the man pressed. "We'll deal with them," Alejandro answered, his voice strained, but resolute. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt. The stranger's gaze hardened. "You don't understand. This isn't just about her." Alejandro stiffened. "Then what is it about?" he demanded. The man took a step closer. Power. Control. What she knew was never supposed to get out. Alejandro's face went pale. He hadn't realized. He hadn't known just how deep Gisela's connections ran. She was the mayor of Isla Bonita, yes. But she was more than that. She was a key. A key to something much larger than either of them could fathom. The stranger leaned in, his voice low and menacing. "She knew about the deal. The one that started long before you two ever met." Alejandro's breath caught in his throat. "What deal?" he whispered. The man's lips curled into a grin, dark, predatory. "The one that could destroy everything." In that moment, Alejandro understood. His world was unraveling, and Gisela had been the only one who could stop it. But now she was gone, and with her death, the truth was buried. Or so they thought. But there were still eyes watching, still ears listening, still a few who hadn't forgotten. The town was quiet, but the storm was coming. Gisela's murder wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The air in the town seemed to thicken, as if holding its breath. The people of Isla Bonita carried on with their lives, unaware of the storm gathering just beyond the horizon. But there were whispers still. A few couldn't let it go. Gisela had been more than a figurehead. She'd been part of something much larger than anyone realized. Her marriage to Alejandro, once seen as a simple love story, was now a tangled web of secrets and lies. But the truth had a way of clawing its way to the surface. It always did. Weeks passed. Then came the strange sightings. First, it was just a few locals who swore they saw a figure standing near the edge of the forest at night. A woman's silhouette, faint but unmistakable. At first, people thought it was just their minds playing tricks, grief manifesting in strange ways. But then something shifted. A news report surfaced one morning, buried under the usual headlines of petty crimes and minor scandals. A fisherman had found something. The body of a woman, washed up on a rocky shore. The description matched Gisela, but there was something off. Her eyes, they were wide open, and the expression on her face was one of pure terror. The report seemed to vanish just as quickly as it had appeared. The town didn't know what to make of it. But one thing was certain, Gisela wasn't gone. She wasn't at peace. And whatever had happened to her, it wasn't over. Detective Rosa Garcia had always been skeptical of the rumors. But she couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at her gut. Something was wrong. She had known Gisela from her youth, admired her from afar as the young, ambitious woman rose through the ranks. But now, the air felt heavy with unanswered questions. Gisela's death hadn't made sense from the start. The investigation had been rushed, too quick, too clean. And there was the one thing that kept eating at her. The silence around Alejandro, Gisela's husband. He was a man with no alibi, no remorse. Rosa knew that look, those hollow eyes, because she had seen it before. That was the look of someone hiding something far too dangerous to reveal. And just like the others, she had begun to notice the strange things, the sudden disappearances of people close to Alejandro, the whispered conversations at odd hours. Rosa began to dig deeper. What she found sent a chill through her bones. Alejandro was no longer just a grieving husband. He was part of something far darker. There were hidden accounts, bank transfers to foreign countries. And then, a name appeared on a document that had been buried under layers of red tape. A name that would change everything. The stranger who had visited Alejandro's house. The one who had spoken of power and control. His name was Daniel Vega. And he wasn't just some businessman or criminal. He was part of an underground syndicate. A network that spanned far beyond the borders of Isla Bonita. Rosa's heart pounded as she pieced it together. Alejandro was more than a man corrupted by greed. He was a pawn. And Gisela? Gisela had uncovered it all. She had been on the verge of exposing the syndicate's operations when she had married the wrong man. Her death was no accident. It had been planned, and it didn't end with her. Rosa's investigation led her into a world of lies, manipulation, and betrayal. A world where death wasn't the end, it was just a way to silence the truth. But the truth, like a flame, had a way of finding its way through the dark. Rosa could feel it. It was only a matter of time before it consumed everything. And soon, she'd be forced to decide how far she was willing to go. Because the people behind Gisela's death? They wouldn't stop. Not until every trace of her was erased. And Rosa was the only one left standing in their way. Rosa could feel the weight of it, like a storm cloud on the edge of her vision. Her every step felt heavier, as if the walls around her were closing in. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, but there was no turning back now. She had uncovered too much. The investigation had led her down a dark, twisting path, one that had made her question everything. Every ally she had once trusted now seemed suspect. And the deeper she dug, the more she realized that the town of Isla Bonita wasn't the peaceful haven it appeared to be. It was a playground for shadows. One night, as Rosa sat at her desk, reviewing the files on Daniel Vega, the door to her office creaked open. She looked up, expecting to see a colleague or maybe a late-night janitor. But it was neither. It was Alejandro. His face was pale, drawn tight with something like fear or guilt. He stepped into the room slowly, as if unsure whether he should be there at all. Rosa didn't hide the suspicion that surged within her. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tight. Alejandro didn't answer immediately. Instead, he locked the door behind him, his eyes flicking nervously toward the window, as if he expected someone to be watching. "Rosa," he said, his voice strained. "I didn't come here to make things worse. I came to warn you." Rosa's heart skipped a beat. Warn her? Warn her about what? She studied him carefully, unsure whether to trust his sudden visit. "You've been digging into things you shouldn't," he continued, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "You don't know what you're up against." Rosa felt a rush of unease, but she didn't back down. "I'm investigating a murder, Alejandro."
"My job."
"Something you know a lot about." He flinched, his eyes flickering with a mix of panic and something darker, something dangerous. "I never wanted this," he muttered. Gisela, she was right. She was getting too close. He stepped closer to her desk, lowering his voice further. "You don't understand. There are people who will stop at nothing to keep this buried. Rosa's instincts flared. Alejandro wasn't here to confess. He was here to manipulate. To protect yourself, she said, her words sharp. You think I'll just back off because you're scared? He didn't respond to her accusation. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph. He slid it across the table to her. Rosa picked it up, and her eyes widened. The photograph was of Gisela alive. But there was something else. Gisela was standing in front of a large, nondescript building, her back to the camera. In the corner of the photo, just barely visible, was a man, tall, with dark features and a face that made Rosa's blood run cold. It was Daniel Vega. Rosa's hand trembled as she turned the photo over. On the back, scrawled in Gisela's handwriting, were 2 words, "They know." A chill ran down her spine. Alejandro's voice broke through her shock. Gisela found out what they were really doing. She was going to expose it. Everything. All of it. But she didn't make it in time. Rosa's mind raced. She had been right. Gisela had been closer to the truth than anyone had realized. The syndicate wasn't just a criminal organization. It was connected to every level of power in the town. And Alejandro had been a part of it from the very beginning. But now, something had changed. I'm trying to get out, Alejandro said, his eyes darting around, as if the walls themselves might be listening. But they won't let me. They won't let any of us. Rosa's heart beat faster. Who? She demanded. Who are they? Before Alejandro could answer, a sharp knock came at the door. It was fast, urgent, but with no hesitation. Rosa froze, her hand still holding the photograph. Alejandro's face went white. They know you're here, he whispered. You need to leave. Now. Rosa didn't hesitate. She shoved the photograph into her pocket and rose to her feet, but before she could reach the door, it burst open. 2 men in dark suits stepped in. Their eyes locked onto Alejandro first, and then to her. One of them was tall, with cold, dead eyes. The other had a scar running down his cheek. The tall one spoke first, his voice low and deliberate. Detective Garcia, I think it's time you took a little break from this case. The air seemed to freeze. Rosa's fingers brushed the side of her gun, hidden under her jacket, but before she could make a move, Alejandro stepped in front of her. No, he said, his voice a strange mixture of anger and desperation. She's not going anywhere. For a split second, there was a tense silence. And then the tall man's lips curled into a dark smile. You really think you can protect her now, Alejandro? He asked softly. We all have our roles to play. Rosa's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't just an arrest. This was something worse. And whatever game Alejandro was trying to play, it was over. But Rosa wasn't backing down. She was going to find the truth. Even if it meant facing down the very people who controlled the town. The tall man stepped closer, his gaze locked onto Rosa. The coldness in his eyes was the kind that suggested he didn't see her as a person, but as an obstacle. Alejandro's body was rigid, standing between her and the 2 strangers. For a brief, fleeting moment, his eyes met hers, almost as if he were pleading for her to stay calm. But it was too late. I told you to leave, the tall man said, his voice even, but with an edge of finality. Rosa's pulse quickened, but she didn't flinch. She didn't move. Her hand hovered just inches from her gun. Her mind raced, but she kept her voice steady. I'm not going anywhere, she said. The taller man chuckled darkly, the sound filling the room. Is that so? He asked, stepping closer to her, his steps slow, deliberate. He was savoring the moment. Rosa kept her gaze locked on him, her fingers inching toward her weapon. Look, I don't know who you are, she said, her voice calm but sharp. But this is over. You've made a mistake. He stopped just in front of her, his eyes narrowing. I don't think you understand the situation, he replied, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. You think you're the one in control here, detective? You're not. You never were. Behind him, the other man with the scar on his face made a sudden move, reaching for his jacket. Rosa reacted instantly. Her hand shot out, grabbing the barrel of her gun and drawing it swiftly. But before she could aim, the tall man's hand was on her wrist, twisting it painfully, forcing the gun to the side. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said through clenched teeth, his grip tightening on her arm. The pressure was excruciating, but Rosa fought to stay calm. Her mind raced, calculating, thinking 3 steps ahead. She could feel the sweat beading on her forehead, the adrenaline flooding her veins. She had to get out. "Let go of her," Alejandro's voice came out in a low growl. The tall man's eyes flicked to Alejandro, a small, almost imperceptible smirk curling his lips. "You should have stayed out of this, Alejandro," he said, his voice condescending. "You were always too weak for this life. We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us?" Alejandro took a step forward, his eyes wild, almost desperate. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm trying to fix this. I can't keep living like this. The tall man cut him off with a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. "Save it," he said, his voice suddenly cold. He turned back to Rosa, his face hardening. "I told you to leave," he repeated, his tone now more menacing. Rosa knew she had seconds, maybe less, to make a choice. She twisted her wrist, leveraging the small bit of leverage she had left, and pulled her gun free with a sudden force, aiming it straight at the tall man's chest. For a moment, everything froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The tension between them was electric. Alejandro's breath was shallow, his eyes wide with fear. The scarred man's hand twitched at his side. The tall man didn't flinch. "You think you can stop this?" he asked, almost bored. "You think pulling a gun on me changes anything? You've already lost." Rosa's eyes flicked to Alejandro, her mind moving faster than her heart could keep up. He was shaking now, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want this. I didn't want any of this." Rosa's eyes narrowed. He was terrified. But was he terrified for himself? Or for her? "Then help me," she said, her voice low, steady. "Help me stop this." The tall man scoffed, stepping closer again. "You're too late. The wheels are already in motion. You're not in control anymore, detective. None of you are." Rosa's grip on the gun tightened. The room felt suffocating, the air around them thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Alejandro looked as if he were on the verge of breaking. He was already deep in it, deeper than she realized. And now he was tangled in something far bigger than just a murder. The game had changed. The tall man took another step forward, his posture threatening. Rosa's finger twitched on the trigger, but before she could make a move, a sharp sound shattered the air. A single gunshot. Rosa's eyes widened. She didn't move. She couldn't. For a split second, everything froze again. The sound of the bullet seemed to echo in the small room. Then, the tall man staggered back, his hand clutching his chest. Alejandro had moved. He'd pulled the gun from the desk drawer behind him and in one swift motion, fired. Rosa's heart hammered in her chest as she saw the blood soaking through the tall man's suit. "Go," Alejandro rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Get out. I'll hold them off." The scarred man, his eyes now wild with rage, lunged toward Alejandro. But Rosa didn't hesitate. She didn't think. She darted for the door, grabbing Alejandro's arm as she passed. They raced out into the hall, the sound of footsteps thundering behind them. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The hallway stretched out before them, dark and narrow, the distant echo of footsteps growing louder behind them. Rosa's heart pounded in her chest as she tugged at Alejandro's arm, pulling him along. "We need to move faster," she hissed, glancing over her shoulder. Alejandro was stumbling, his face pale with fear. The gun he'd used to shoot the tall man was still clutched in his hand, but his grip was weak. His eyes were wide with panic, his breath ragged. Rosa's mind raced. She couldn't afford to slow down, not now, not when they were already so deep into this. Ahead, the stairwell led to the back exit, where they could disappear into the night. But she knew they couldn't make it out that easily. The men wouldn't stop, not after what had just happened. She had seen that look in the scarred man's eyes, pure rage, a deep hunger for retribution. "Move, Alejandro," she snapped, her voice sharp. But he didn't respond. He was too slow, his legs dragging as he stumbled, as if he was in some sort of trance. His mind, it seemed, had already shut down. Rosa pulled harder, forcing him into motion, and they reached the stairwell. The thick, metallic door creaked open with a groan, its hinges old and rusted. They were halfway down the stairs when she heard it. A loud crash echoed from above them, followed by shouting. The scarred man was gaining on them, and the sound of his boots pounding against the floor sent a cold rush of dread through her. Rosa reached the bottom of the stairwell and swung the door open, glancing around wildly. The alley was empty, quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of the town. But they didn't have time to breathe. They couldn't risk being seen. She yanked Alejandro forward again, urging him toward the shadows. "There's a car just around the corner," she said, her voice urgent. "We'll make it out. Just keep moving." Alejandro nodded, but his eyes were glazed over. It was as if he couldn't process what was happening, as if he had already given up on escaping. Rosa cursed under her breath and grabbed his arm once more, pulling him faster. They reached the corner, and there, just as she had promised, was the old sedan she'd left parked by the curb. The engine was already running, its headlights cutting through the night. She pushed him into the passenger seat and then slid into the driver's side. Her hands were shaking as she gripped the steering wheel, but she didn't have time to think. She had to get them out of here, had to get them as far away from this nightmare as possible. The tires screeched as she floored the gas, tearing through the empty streets. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Behind her, the sound of a car engine roared to life. Rosa's stomach twisted. They were being followed. She could feel it deep in her gut. Someone had gotten into a car, and they were closing in fast. "Hold on," she shouted, slamming the accelerator harder. The car lurched forward, swerving as she took the corners too sharply, trying to shake the tailing vehicle. Alejandro, still silent beside her, stared straight ahead, his face drawn, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. It was as if he hadn't even noticed they were being pursued. Rosa didn't dare look back. She had to focus on the road. But the pursuer wasn't far behind. She could hear the engine getting louder with every passing second. Suddenly, the car behind them sped up, its headlights blinding as it surged forward. Rosa's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror for a split second. The scarred man's car was inches from her bumper. Her chest tightened. There was no way she could outrun them, not like this. A sharp noise broke through her concentration. A bullet. It slammed into the rear window, shattering the glass and sending it raining down in jagged shards. Rosa's heart skipped a beat. They were shooting at them now. She could feel the air shift. Their lives were hanging by a thread. "Get down," Rosa shouted, ducking instinctively as the next shot pierced through the air. Alejandro didn't respond. A split second later, the car swerved violently, and Rosa fought the wheel to keep control. The car behind them wasn't just chasing them anymore. They were trying to ram them off the road. Rosa's hands were slick with sweat as she jerked the wheel hard to the left, barely avoiding the oncoming traffic on the narrow street. But the scarred man's car was relentless. It veered to the right, cutting off any chance of escape, forcing them to the edge of the road. She had only seconds to make a decision. Her eyes darted around, searching for an exit, a way out. Up ahead, the street turned sharply to the right. It was a narrow alleyway, barely wide enough for the car, but if she could make it through, they'd lose the tail. Her breath caught in her throat as she slammed the steering wheel to the right, sending the car careening into the alley. The tires screeched as the sedan slid sideways, nearly crashing into the brick walls on either side. The car behind them hesitated for only a moment, then followed. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse now. Rosa's mind raced. If she could just... A loud bang. The scarred man's car slammed into their rear bumper, sending them spinning out of control. The world tilted. Everything went dark. The world spun around Rosa, the screech of tires and the crash of metal blending into a deafening roar. The car's frame groaned as it collided with the alley's brick walls, its tires screeching as it lost traction. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. Time stretched into a slow, dizzying blur. Rosa's head snapped to the side, her vision swimming. She felt the sickening jolt of impact, followed by the sharp sting of her seatbelt digging into her chest. The air was thick with the smell of burning rubber and gasoline. She gasped for breath, trying to clear her vision, but her head was heavy. The seatbelt felt like it was strangling her. She pushed against the wheel, trying to steady herself, but the car was still sliding, its momentum carrying them forward into the alley. Then, with a deafening screech, the car came to a halt, the front bumper wedged into the wall. The headlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Rosa's heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't tell if it was from the crash or the pounding adrenaline coursing through her veins. She reached up, her fingers numb, and unclipped the seatbelt. Her chest was tight, her limbs sluggish, but she forced herself to move. Her fingers fumbled over the door handle. It was stuck. "Come on," she muttered through clenched teeth, yanking at it with all her strength. She finally managed to pry it open. Her legs felt like jelly as she stumbled out of the car, her body protesting the movement. She didn't stop to check Alejandro. She couldn't afford to. Behind her, the scarred man's car screeched to a halt. The door slammed open, and a dark figure emerged from the vehicle. The man was tall, looming. His face was twisted in fury. He started toward her, his footsteps slow and deliberate, but his eyes were locked on her like prey. Rosa didn't wait. Her body reacted on instinct, and she bolted down the alley, her legs burning with the effort. She could hear him gaining on her, his footsteps getting louder, faster. He was close. The alley twisted ahead, narrowing as it veered to the left. Rosa took the turn hard, forcing herself to move faster, trying to find a way out of the maze of narrow streets. She could still hear him, his breathing heavy and labored. He wasn't giving up. Her eyes scanned the alley for any sign of escape. A window. It was an old, boarded-up storefront on the left side. Rosa's breath hitched. She could hear the man closing in, but there was no time to hesitate. She dashed toward the window, grabbing a loose wooden plank and ripping it off with one swift motion. Her fingers bled from the rough edges, but she didn't stop. She ducked under the frame and squeezed through the window, her body scraping against the jagged edges of the broken glass. Her breath caught in her throat as she tumbled into the dark, abandoned building on the other side. She rolled to her feet, her heart racing, her ears straining to listen. The alley was eerily quiet now. Had she lost him? She didn't dare take a breath. Rosa took a few cautious steps forward, the sound of her shoes echoing off the cracked floorboards. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she could make out faint outlines of broken furniture, shattered glass, and piles of old, forgotten debris. There was no sign of the scarred man yet, but she knew he wasn't far behind. Her mind raced, calculating. Where could she go? She needed a weapon, a way to defend herself if he found her. She turned left, toward the far corner of the building. There was a door at the end of the hall, barely visible in the shadows. She knew it had to lead somewhere. She sprinted toward it, her hands trembling as she reached for the handle. The door creaked open. It led outside, to a narrow side street. But before she could step out into the night, she heard it. A voice. Low and cold. "You can't outrun this, detective." She froze. The scarred man was there, his face half-lit by the dim glow of the streetlight. He was blocking her only way out. "I've been chasing you for too long," he said, his voice a low growl. "You're not going anywhere." Rosa's chest tightened. There was nowhere to run, no more tricks. The man took a step forward, his hand twitching at his side. But something in the way he moved made her hesitate. He wasn't as sure of himself as he seemed. He was watching her, waiting for her to make a move. And that's when she saw it. A flash of light in the corner of her eye. The sound of tires screeching. A car. It came out of nowhere, its headlights blinding her for a moment. The scarred man's eyes darted to the car, just for a second. That was enough. Rosa lunged forward, throwing her weight into him, knocking him off balance. He staggered back, just as the car screeched to a halt beside them. The door swung open, and Alejandro, breathing heavily, eyes wide with panic, was behind the wheel. "Get in," he shouted. Without thinking, Rosa grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the car. They both scrambled into the vehicle. The scarred man was already recovering, his hand reaching for a gun at his side. But it was too late. Alejandro slammed the car into gear, and with a roar of the engine, they were speeding away, the man's curses echoing in the night. The narrow streets of Isla Bonita disappeared behind them as they raced into the darkness, away from the nightmare. But the truth was, there was no escaping this.
Not now.
Not when they had already crossed the line. Rosa's fingers tightened around the seat, her mind still reeling. She hadn't won yet. She hadn't even begun to unravel what was really happening. But one thing was clear. The chase was far from over. The car tore through the winding streets, its headlights cutting through the thick darkness of the night. Rosa's heart was still racing, the adrenaline that had spiked in the alley slowly beginning to settle into a raw, pulsing dread. She glanced at Alejandro. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his face drawn, his eyes flicking nervously between the road and the rearview mirror. "He's still behind us," he muttered, his voice tight, barely audible. Rosa didn't need to look back to know it was true. She could feel the weight of their pursuer's presence, even though she couldn't see him. It was a cold, creeping sensation, the kind of pressure that settled in your gut and didn't let go. "Do you know where we're going?" Rosa asked, her voice sharp. She couldn't afford to lose focus.
Not now.
Not after everything. Alejandro's gaze shifted to her, his eyes flicking with something like panic. I don't know," he admitted, his voice shaky. "I don't know where to go. I just needed to get out of there." Rosa cursed under her breath. This wasn't the time to be lost. She needed a plan. She glanced out the window, scanning the streets. The shadows of the town were closing in around them, familiar and yet alien, like a maze she couldn't escape. They had to leave Isla Bonita, and fast. But where could they go? And who could they trust now? Rosa's thoughts spun. She felt exposed. In danger. She hadn't thought this through. But then, something shifted in the distance. A glimmer of light, a figure standing in the middle of the road. A woman. Rosa's eyes narrowed. There was something strange about her. She stood unmoving, as if waiting. Almost like a ghost. "Stop the car," Rosa said suddenly, her voice low but commanding. Alejandro shot her a confused look, but obeyed, slamming on the brakes. The car jolted to a halt, and Rosa quickly unbuckled her seatbelt, throwing open the door.
"Wait."
"What are you?" "Stay here." She cut him off, her eyes narrowing on the figure. "I need to see something." Before Alejandro could protest, Rosa was out of the car, her feet hitting the asphalt with a thud. She didn't have a clear plan, but the woman standing in the middle of the road seemed too strange to ignore. Rosa's instincts were pulling her toward the figure, like a magnet. As she approached, the woman didn't move. Her face was hidden in the shadows, but Rosa could see the outline of her body. Tall, thin, and unnaturally still. Rosa slowed her steps as she neared her, cautious now. Every nerve in her body was screaming that something wasn't right.
"Who are you?"
Rosa asked, her voice firm. "What do you want?" The woman's head tilted slightly, as if listening to Rosa's words, but she didn't answer. Instead, she took a single step forward, revealing her face to the dim light of the street lamp. Rosa's breath hitched. The woman's face was pale, almost sickly white, with hollow, black eyes that seemed to swallow the light. Her lips were thin and stretched into a faint, unsettling smile. "I've been waiting for you," the woman said in a voice that sent chills down Rosa's spine. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried an unmistakable weight. Rosa took a cautious step back, her hand instinctively moving toward the gun at her side. "Waiting for me?" she repeated, her voice tight. "For what?" The woman stepped closer, her movements deliberate and unnervingly smooth. "You're looking for answers," the woman said, her voice barely a murmur in the night air. "But you won't find them by running." Rosa's heart skipped. The woman was right. Everything felt like it was spinning out of control, like the walls of the town were closing in on her. She needed to get back to Alejandro. She needed to. Before Rosa could move, the woman spoke again, her eyes never leaving Rosa's face. Gisela knew, she whispered. She knew what was coming, but she wasn't ready to see it through. Rosa froze. Her mind raced. Gisela. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been right. Gisela had been so close to the truth. But she hadn't been able to finish what she started. Where is she? Rosa demanded, her voice rising with urgency. What happened to hers? The woman's lips curled into an eerie smile, her eyes glinting with something dark. She's gone, the woman said softly, her voice cold and final. But you can still make a choice. Rosa stepped back, shaking her head in disbelief. Make a choice? She repeated, her mind reeling. What are you talking about? The woman took another step forward, her voice soft but insistent. You can still stop them, she said, almost coaxing. But it's not going to be easy. And you'll have to let go of everything you thought you knew. The truth isn't what you think it is. Rosa's hand clenched around her gun, her fingers trembling. Her mind was spinning. The woman was offering something she didn't understand. A way to end it all. To stop whatever this was. But the price felt too high. I don't need your riddles, Rosa spat, turning on her heel. She started to head back toward the car, but the woman's voice stopped her. Think about it, she called out softly. There's still time, but not much. Rosa didn't look back. She couldn't. She reached the car, throwing open the door and sliding inside. Alejandro's eyes were wide with confusion, his face pale under the dim light. What was that? He asked, his voice shaking. Who is she? Rosa didn't answer. She couldn't. She couldn't explain any of it.
Not yet.
As the car roared to life, Rosa drove off, her mind buzzing with questions she didn't have answers for. And behind them, the woman watched, a cold smile still etched on her face. Somehow, she knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And now, the chase had begun. The night was still, but it felt as if the air itself was charged, thick with a sense of something dark, something inevitable. Rosa's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. Alejandro, still shaken, sat next to her in a daze, eyes wide, mouth moving as if trying to form words but failing. Neither of them spoke for a long time, the only sound the hum of the engine cutting through the empty streets. The town of Isla Bonita felt like a distant memory, the weight of their escape pulling them farther from the past, but closer to an unknown, terrifying future. Rosa's mind churned. The woman, the strange warning, the cryptic message that hadn't made sense, but felt as if it carried an undeniable truth. She couldn't shake the words. You can still stop them, but you'll have to let go of everything you thought you knew. What did that mean? What was she supposed to let go of? What was she holding on to in the first place? The truth had been slipping through her fingers for so long, tangled in lies, murder, and secrets. And now it was like she was at the edge of a cliff, staring down into the abyss, not sure whether she could step forward or pull away. She glanced at Alejandro, his face pale in the dim light. He was still processing everything, probably still couldn't believe how far he'd been pulled into this mess. But there was something about his silence that made her uneasy. Something wasn't right. We need to go to the safe house, she said, breaking the silence, her voice hoarse, unsteady. It's the only place we'll be safe. Alejandro nodded, but his gaze didn't meet hers. He was looking out the window, staring into the night, lost in thought. Rosa's fingers drummed nervously on the wheel, eyes scanning the empty road. Her mind wouldn't stop racing. Suddenly, the headlights of another car appeared in the rearview mirror. It was distant, but its presence was unmistakable. Another chase. Another predator. Rosa's heart skipped. It was him. The scarred man. But why hadn't he caught up to them yet? Had he stopped? Or was he waiting for the right moment to strike? Alejandro shifted in his seat, his voice soft, almost a whisper. They're still out there, aren't they? Rosa's jaw clenched. Yes. And that's when she realized. They'd never be safe. Not from the man chasing them, and not from the truth. The darkness they were running from wasn't just a person. It was everything that had been hidden, everything that had been manipulated and twisted. The choices they made, every lie, every step forward, had led them to this inevitable moment. The car behind them grew closer. Rosa's grip tightened on the wheel. "We have to get off the main road," she said, her voice shaking with determination.
Now.
Alejandro shot a glance at her, and for a moment, their eyes met, two people caught in a web they didn't understand. He nodded again, gripping the seat, eyes wide with something between fear and resolve. Rosa swerved the car sharply, taking a detour onto a smaller road that cut through the dense woods surrounding the town. The headlights of the pursuing car followed them, but it couldn't match the speed, the agility. For a moment, they were free. At least, that's what Rosa told herself. But as they sped deeper into the woods, the forest closing in on them from all sides, the strangest feeling settled in her chest. She wasn't just being chased by a person. The chase, this entire nightmare, was much bigger than one man. Much bigger than her. And deep down, Rosa knew the truth she had been running from all along. She had become a part of it. The scarred man wasn't the only one hunting them now. They were being hunted by the truth itself. The headlights of the car behind them grew dimmer, but the road ahead seemed darker, more treacherous than ever. Rosa pushed the pedal to the floor, hoping for a miracle that wasn't coming. The trees blurred past. The road twisted and turned, disappearing into the shadows. Every turn they took felt like a step deeper into something they couldn't escape. And then the car behind them pulled up beside them. Too fast, too close. The scarred man's face appeared in the window, his grin wide, full of malice. Rosa didn't hesitate. She slammed the brakes, sending the car into a spin. For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the air, suspended in time. The car twisted, tires screaming against the gravel, and then everything went dark. A final crash. The sound of metal against stone, of glass shattering, the car rolling, tumbling, spinning. The world was a blur of motion, of light and dark, of sharp, painful jolts. And then silence. When Rosa's eyes fluttered open, the world felt impossibly still. The car was upside down, its engine dead. The air was thick with dust and smoke. She could hear Alejandro's labored breathing beside her. He was alive. But the scarred man, was he? Rosa's head was spinning, her vision swimming in and out. She could hear the faint hum of the wind, the distant call of animals in the woods. But nothing, no footsteps, no sound of pursuit, reached her ears. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was silence. And in that silence, Rosa realized something else. The choice was no longer about surviving. It was about what came next. She didn't know where this road would take her. She didn't know what awaited her at the end. But she was done running. With shaky hands, she reached for the door, her fingers slipping as she pushed it open. The moment she stepped out of the wrecked car, her legs unsteady, her body bruised but alive, she knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. And whatever happened next, she was ready to face the darkness. The wind carried a heavy silence through the woods as Rosa stood, her back pressed against the crumpled car, her breath shallow and quick. The night felt unnervingly still now, the crash ringing in her ears like an echo of a nightmare. Her head throbbed, her body bruised and sore from the impact, but she could still feel the weight of everything pressing on her. The scarred man was gone. For now, at least. She could hear the soft rustle of the trees, the chirp of distant insects, the occasional snap of twigs. But there was no sign of pursuit, no sounds of footsteps. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was alone. Completely alone. Alejandro was still inside the car, unconscious but alive. Rosa had to drag herself away from the wreck to make sure he was okay. The air around her seemed too quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Her hands were trembling as she checked on him, brushing the dust and blood from his face, her fingers soft against his skin. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. "Rosa?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but she could hear the confusion and the fear behind it. "You're okay," she said, trying to smile, though her own heart felt heavy with 1,000 unasked questions. "We made it. We're safe for now." He blinked a few times, processing her words. "Where are we?" he asked, his voice still unsteady. "What happened?" She didn't know how to explain it. The chase. The car crash. The strange woman in the road. "We need to move," she said instead, her voice tight. "We can't stay here. Not for long." With effort, she helped him out of the car, her mind already racing ahead to their next step. They had no clear plan, no destination. But there was one thing she knew for certain. She couldn't keep running from whatever this was. And she wouldn't. As they walked, the moonlight filtering through the trees, she could feel the weight of the choice she had made, the choice to face what was coming, to finally find the truth. But deep inside, she knew it wasn't just about the answers anymore.
It was about taking control.
The road ahead was dark, full of uncertainty, but for the first time, she didn't feel lost. Together, they would uncover the rest of the story, no matter the cost. In the distance, the faintest sound of sirens could be heard, a reminder that the world was still turning, still moving forward. But for Rosa, it was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The chase was over, and the truth had only just begun to reveal itself.